Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see more videos like that. And ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for the last video of list season. It's sad that it's coming to an end, but it had to eventually, and I am excited to resume normal reviews very soon. So let's go ahead and get started with this list. Today we are talking about the top 15 best movies of 2022. Now, 2022 was, like I said in my worst movies list, an actually really good year for movies. For that reason, it was incredibly hard to narrow down movies this year, and so much so that I wanted to talk about 15 movies again. I haven't done that since 2019, which I think has been the best movie year we've had in quite a while, but 2022 might even beat 2019, which was already a really great movie year. So I did have to do 15 this year, and I think it's very fitting. We saw a great year for horror, a great year for just big blockbusters, and a great year for just complete creativity. So let's go ahead and not waste any more time and get started. This is my list of the top 15 best movies of 2022. At number 15, we start off fittingly with horror, which I think had a great year this year, and you're going to be seeing a couple more horror movies in this list. But let's get started with Bodies, 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 an A24 film that is a little different from your typical A24 film. In fact, A24 had a very interesting year this year overall, I would say. They didn't necessarily release as super experimental films as they have in the past, or ones that could be called more art house adjacent. This movie being at number 15 just shows you how strong of a year this was, because I really enjoyed this movie. This was simply a great whodunit for the Gen Z audience, is the best way I could describe it. It has some horrific elements in it for sure. There are some points where you can feel tension. But as a whole, I would actually say that this comes closer to just a sort of dark comedy in many ways. The movie is poking fun and doing a bit of a satire of how Gen Z acts, specifically with technology, and I think the overall message at the end is very fitting for Gen Z's brand of humor. I think all the performances in this movie are great. Like I said in my review earlier this year, I think Maria Bakalova as Bee is a really intriguing main character. She is not your typical type of main character, in my opinion. In fact, she doesn't even necessarily start as the one that you expect to be the main character, but it sort of becomes that way over the course of the movie, which I find really interesting. Amandla Stenberg is great as Sophie and has a lot of layers that you're going to unpack about her, which are very intriguing. But really, it's Rachel Sennott that stands on top in this movie as Alice. She just goes full force into her character and really dedicates to it. Like I said, the message of this movie is very effective, as all these people are paranoid about who did this murder and keep on pointing fingers at each other. And the ending twist just works so delightfully well in terms of what this movie is going for. I think the kills are fairly creative, and I like the way this movie plays out overall. It's a very fun ride, and one that you definitely need to see if you haven't. Number 14 is the second film by Cooper Raiff, who is a writer, director, producer, pretty much almost everything in this movie, just like he was in the film Shithouse. And this is yet another movie where he is playing this character who is sort of in a transition stage of adulthood and college-aged, and he's just trying to sort of figure himself out. I think this movie has a lot of real heart to it, and it's really interesting to see how that unfolds over the course of the movie. Cooper Raiff plays such a delightful character in here, and I know some people say that he makes his character likable because he's the one writing him, but I think that Cooper Raiff is actually a more honest writer than some people give him credit for, because he does show some very real flaws of this character that he goes through. Dakota Johnson is actually the one who comes away as the real highlight here, though. Her performance is so nuanced and powerful and haunting in many places, and very touching at the end of it all. Her character arc is super interesting, and I like the way that Rafe reveals the sort of layers that this character has. You never are exactly sure what's going on with her at all times in the movie, but as the layers peel back, you start to understand her character more and more, and she starts becoming more interesting. The girl who plays the daughter is great as well. I found her to be a very delightful character, Vanessa Burghardt as Lola. This film is very unassuming and plays it very simple in many ways, and it's simple in a very deceptive way. And I say that because there is actually a lot of complexity going in this movie, despite the fact that it is a very simple story at its heart. But I think the way that Cooper goes into the complexities of human relationships is done in a way that is so underrated and so well done, and it surprises me that not more people are giving this movie the attention it deserves. This is a superb film, and it shows Cooper Raiff at the top of his game. I just can't wait to see what this guy does next. At number 13 is Jordan Peele's latest film, his third film, Nope. And personally, I liked this one a little better than Us, but I still don't like it quite as much as Get Out. And this one is so interesting for Jordan Peele. It shows once again, and I think definitively proves, that Jordan Peele is never going to pull the same trick twice. Each of his movies have been vastly different from one another. This movie pretty much gives Jordan Peele's definitive definition of what Hollywood is, in my opinion. He views Hollywood as an institution that chews people up and spits them out and leaves them behind once they no longer need them, especially minorities. And he sort of proves that through showing a group of people, a family, whose father was the first black man on film, which is based in historical reality, and the fact that this person was sort of left behind and forgotten. It also is sort of a critique of spectacle and the fact that we as a society enjoy looking at horrific things in real life more than caring about the victims or more than caring about the people who suffered through them. We like seeing the big explosions or the big disasters, but we don't really do anything about them besides just looking at them and watching in awe. This movie just simply looks great. This is one of the most beautifully shot movies of the year by far, and there's just so much unique cinematography going on. The way that they do this UFO, this alien object in the movie, is very interesting and very unique. And the fact that the alien is treated like an animal is also a pretty cool idea. There's so many layers to peel back in this movie of the idea of how Hollywood exploits people. So it's no wonder this movie didn't get nominated for any Oscars with that very clear and very biting commentary, even though it definitely should have, at least for cinematography, in my opinion. And the performances in this movie are all around great. Daniel Kaluuya gives another great one. This guy is one of the undeniable modern greats. Everything he is in, he just knocks it out of the park. Keke Palmer is a huge highlight here, going up against Daniel Kaluuya's more straight-laced character with a character that is very energetic and full of life and very funny. I loved her character, and it was so fun to follow along with her. And Steven Yeun was endlessly intriguing in this movie. There's so much to love here, and it just sort of has a classic movie feel while still being a movie that critiques the movie industry, which I think is sort of fitting. And yeah, this movie is really special and so shows Jordan Peele as just simply a force to be reckoned with. Well, I told you it would be here in my worst movies of the year list, and yeah, it's the inverse of Disney's Pinocchio, the much better inverse of it, which is Guillermo del Toro's vision for this puppet character. And man, this is such a great vision and shows that Del Toro is just someone who we can never appreciate enough, in my opinion. I just love what Del Toro said about animation at the Golden Globes. He said that animation is a medium, not just something meant for kids. It is an art form meant for everyone. And I think his Pinocchio movie more than proves that, because yes, there is a children's story at the heart of this movie for sure, and this movie will undeniably appeal to kids, and I think that was part of the reason why it was made. But Del Toro clearly had adults in mind with this story too, especially with the character arc that Geppetto goes through. In fact, in some ways you could debate that the first half of this movie is as much Geppetto's movie as it is Pinocchio's. There is a point where it shifts to being about Pinocchio, of course, but there's a lot of the movie that focuses on Geppetto, specifically the sorrow he goes through in losing his son. And I like that the movie emphasizes on him using Pinocchio as a way to try to cope with that loss. More proof that this movie isn't just for kids is the fact that this movie is set against a background of fascist Italy, and it does not shy away from that at all. There are points where it shows the huge violence, and Pinocchio himself even goes to war in the movie for fascist Italy, and eventually becomes a sort of political revolutionary in the story as well. And it's really interesting to see what fascist Italy's response to Pinocchio is, calling him some sort of monster, but then also seeing the potential for him being an essentially immortal soldier that they can just keep on using. It's really intriguing how they develop that, and the movie being set against that backdrop creates for a very foreboding landscape at times, but one where Del Toro's commentary comes through loud and clear. All the voice acting here is great. Ewan McGregor is utterly excellent as Jiminy Cricket. I think they did a great job with the character here. This is probably my favorite version of Jiminy Cricket ever. I just love what they did with him. Gregory Mann is excellent as Pinocchio and has a beautiful singing voice. And David Bradley is awesome as Geppetto. I really liked what he did in here. This is just a beautiful looking movie, of course. The animation is striking to look at. The stop motion animation. I don't know if I've ever seen a movie that has looked as beautiful as this one in recent memory. This is just some of the most striking animation I have seen, and it is, in my opinion, the best animated movie of the year. I did see Puss in Boots, by the way, which a lot of people have said is the best animated movie of this year, and that one comes close. But I do prefer Pinocchio over this one over that one for sure. And yeah, you need to check out this movie if you haven't. It is such a creative masterpiece and shows Del Toro at the top of his game. At number 11 is a movie I feel like hasn't been talked about nearly enough this year, and that is The Fallout. Now, this movie did come out earlier this year, and it was only a streaming exclusive, I believe, on HBO Max, so it's no wonder that a lot of people haven't talked about it, but the fact that it hasn't really come up in popular conversation, especially with Jenna Ortega's recent rise in popularity, is sort of surprising to me. This movie is the one that really shows how great of an actress she is, and I think is definitely her best performance of the year, despite the fact that she is really good in Wednesday and X and Scream. But this one really it really proved to me that she could play a character so nuanced and with so many layers and so much to say. In a world where I feel like the news cycle exploits school shootings time and time again in sometimes sickening ways, it is nice to see a movie that treats the subject with at least a degree of sensitivity and not like it's just glorifying the school shooter or whatever. It's nice to see something where the school shooter isn't even shown in any way, shape, or form, and instead focuses on the victims. The stories that they show here, they're of course fictionalized. This isn't a true story, but it is based on so many true stories, which is what makes it powerful. And I think the director here, Megan Park, really knows her Gen Z audience. I think she is very familiar with how Gen Z acts. The way they talk with each other and hang out with each other feels very real too. I like that even though this is a movie about trauma, she still lets the kids be kids, because the kids wouldn't always be talking about their trauma with the shooting all the time. They'd still be hanging out and doing other things, which I like. But of course, there is still that underlying trauma explored very well, especially through Jenna Ortega's character, Veda, who tries her hardest to hide the trauma and to just sort of keep it inside. But the more she does that, the more that it comes out. And I like that she's eventually able to explore that in multiple ways, whether through with her newfound friend who she didn't really have a connection with via Mia, played very well by Maddie Ziegler, or through her very powerful relationship with her sister. And her scenes with the sister are some of the most powerful in the movie and some of my favorite. There was one near the end that happened that really made me tear up because of how authentic it felt. And that's the main emotion I feel from this movie is authenticity. Originally, I said I didn't like the ending of this movie in my initial review of it, but now, even though the ending is very dark, it sort of makes sense. It sort of makes sense with the way the world is that the movie would end off in the way it does. And it's a very sad but very true ending that I think speaks a lot. So check this movie out if you haven't. I think it's one that deserves your attention. And now we move into the top 10. And starting at number 10, we have a movie that was an absolute crowd pleaser for both critics and audiences, a commercial box office success, and deservedly so. And that is, of course, Top Gun Maverick. I'm sure for a lot of people this will be higher on their list, and I absolutely understand why. I think it is one of those rare films where the sequel actually sort of surpasses its predecessor. I actually am not a huge fan of the original Top Gun. There's aspects of it that I just don't care about. But here, that is not the case at all. I think this movie is so well realized and feels positively energetic and full of life in every moment it's on screen. When I saw this in the big screen, I knew that it was something special. The way the sound was just reverberating in your ears, the way the action was just so utterly kinetic, and Tom Cruise's performance that reminds you that we don't have really many actors of his generation or many actors like him anymore. And speaking of Tom Cruise being the last of a dying breed, this movie sort of commentates on that in a sort of meta way, as Tom Cruise's character is sort of realizing that he's not necessarily the type of action hero that he used to be, the very young, full of life person, and that he's starting to need to take on more mentor roles, which he is not ready for in his view. But it's interesting to see him go through that character arc of becoming a mentor, and especially of him developing a relationship with Goose's son Rooster, played excellently by Miles Teller. And the fact that he's exploring his guilt of the fact that he feels sort of responsible for Goose dying all those years back. There's many moments here that will definitely make people who loved the original Top Gun feel nostalgic, but I also think this movie is one that is perfect for a new generation getting introduced to these movies, especially with the new characters here. And the plot is very propulsive and feels full of weight, especially as it seems like someone could die on this mission, and that's what makes it feel so weighty. And I love the ending of this movie, where it just has that epic victory that feels so earned. Overall, Top Gun was a blockbuster we needed this year. It is the movie that I think officially heralded the arrival that the movies are back in theaters. And what an exciting and invigorating prospect that is. Thank you, Top Gun, for bringing movies back, and you were the one that deserved to be in the position to do so. At number 9 is a movie that I think should have been a blockbuster because of the utter scale that it was on, but it did do fairly well, just not nearly as well as something like Top Gun Maverick, and that is Robert Eggers' third film, The Northman. Now, while I don't like this one quite as much as The Witch or The Lighthouse, I still think this movie is quite good in its own right. And sort of like Jordan Peele, this shows that Robert Eggers is the type of director that is not going to do the same thing twice, because this is pretty far from the very low budget feel that The Lighthouse had, or the very classic horror feel that The Witch had. This is a Viking epic in every sense of that word. It is a very familiar story, of course, a very familiar revenge story as well, but the way it is presented is so unique that I think it works really well. And plus, visually, it is just so utterly striking. There are so many visually incredible scenes, and it's one of those bigger feeling movies that you don't really see. One of those bigger feeling epics that doesn't pop up on the screen that much. The performances only serve to accentuate that epic feeling. Alexander Skarsgård gives an off-the-charts excellent performance as Emleth. His performance is intimidating, heartbreaking, and soul-wrenching all at once. Nicole Kidman is also very interesting as the Queen, and has some of the most intriguing nuances in the movie. Ethan Hawke isn't in the movie that much, unfortunately, but I really liked him as well, and I think he gave good reason for Emleth to want to take revenge. And Anya Taylor-Joy, as usual, is great as Olga. This wasn't her best performance to me this year. That goes to The Menu, which is an honorable mention movie for me, by the way. But I did really like her performance here and how she sort of interestingly became the person that was trying to dissuade Amleth from taking revenge and going on this death quest. I like that the movie is building up this idea that Amleth will sort of be vindicated in his revenge by going to Valhalla, and at the end it seems maybe in his view he is, but because of all the carnage and destruction we've seen, it seems more like it's just a fantasy of his that he thinks is going to happen, but we know in reality it isn't real and it's only something he's seeing happen. It is a message we've heard before, like I said, but I think the way that Robert Eggers presents it is well done. And the music in this movie is excellent. So the fights in this movie are bloody and brutal. Some of the most brutal fighting I've seen, but works so well. And this is just an invigorating movie to watch for sure. At number 8 is the movie The Banshees of Inisherin, which was directed by Martin McDonagh and sees two actors uniting from a previous movie of his, Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson. Now, I'll be honest, I have never seen a movie by this director before. This was my first foray into him, and I have to say I am pretty impressed. This movie was so intriguing and so unique in this year.
Who says we're not? Sit somewhere else.
Story at its core. Brendan Gleeson's character is going to break up his
now, if I've done something to you,
with Colin Farrell.
just tell me what I've done to
you.
You didn't do anything to me.
It's just for one simple reason. He's bored of him. It's sort of a funny premise in many ways and seems sort of simplistic for a movie, but that's part of the purpose. On the surface, this movie, much like the island that it is surrounding, is very simple and quaint. It is a very small town drama, and it feels as such. The fact that it's just a friendship breakup, but it still sends waves through the island speaks volumes about what type of drama this island has. But as we look more into this friendship, we realize that there is some real inward hurt going on here, especially in the view of Colin Farrell's character, who doesn't understand what's so boring about him. There's some understanding for why Colin would want to maybe take some time away to focus on his art, but we also understand that sometimes just being a nice person is good enough, and that's what works for Pedrick, and he shouldn't necessarily be villainized for that. And the conflict starts there, but it eventually goes deeper to a point where it becomes really uncomfortable. And it becomes uncomfortable to a point where these people start taking drastic actions against each other, to the point where it's shocking how far they'll go through it. And it becomes much more tragic seeing this friendship just continuing to fall apart at the seams and the lengths that these two characters will go to get a one-up on each other. This movie is very undeniably funny too, don't get me wrong. There are some dark moments here, but the comedy in this movie should not go overlooked. This is very funny, and I think Colin Farrell might give his funniest performance here. I just love how he nails the comedic timing, and he works very well against Brendan Gleeson's much more straight-laced character who is reacting to how Colin Farrell is just annoying him to death. It is very funny in many places. But when the movie does get dark, it lets the darkness stay there. And the transition works super well, in my opinion. Colin Farrell is playing very much against character type in this movie, but when he turns into the character that we've come to expect from him, it's very chilling in many ways and works super well. This movie has a lot more to say than it might seem on the surface. Much like Inisherin, which on the surface seems like a quaint island, but when you look at the background, there's a civil war going on. So watch this movie and look into it to see what it has to offer, because there's a lot to unpeel here. Great film that deserves all the love that it's gotten in the awards season. At number 7 was probably one of my most hyped movies of the year, if not my most hyped, and thankfully it lived up to it, and that is The Batman. I shouldn't have really expected anything less from Matt Reeves, who made one of the best modern-day trilogies out there in the Planet of the Apes. But he really nailed Batman here. There were so many unique choices that this movie decided to take. First of all, it presents Batman in much more of a modern-day detective noir mystery, especially surrounding the Riddler, who plays more like a horror villain than he does a traditional Batman villain, as Batman is trying to uncover the mysteries that the Riddler is leaving behind for him. The dark undertones that this movie has, the eerie undertones it has, work very well, while it also gives it a more comic book feel. This movie feels like sort of a combination of the Tim Burton Batman movies and the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. It has some of the more grounded and realistic stuff that the Christopher Nolan Batman movies has, but it doesn't shy away from the more over-the-top comic book aspects of the Tim Burton movies either. This is especially evident through the fact that we have the Penguin in here, played by Colin Farrell, who is a character that is ridiculous but still works in the landscape of this movie. The Riddler is so menacing here and so frightening, and probably one of my favorite portrayals of Batman villains I've ever seen. Paul Dano plays this character super well. But of course, the highlight here is Robert Pattinson as Batman. He plays Batman so well, and anyone who doubted Robert Pattinson as Batman, I just have to say, in my opinion, you were proven wrong. This is such a fun superhero movie, one that I endlessly enjoyed watching, and one that I probably need to give a rewatch soon because it worked so well with what it did, and it is one of the best modern-day superhero flicks out there. It deserves the love, it deserves the praise, and I'm so glad it got nominated for the award ceremony because it undeniably deserves all its due recognition. At number 6 is The Fabelmans, a movie which has gotten a surprising amount of backlash, but then again, maybe I shouldn't be surprised because it got a debatably biggest award at the Golden Globes. Now, I'll admit, as I've seen more movies over the year, it did go down in my ranking for my 2022 movies, but it's still nearly in my top 5, and I still absolutely love this movie for a variety of reasons. People are probably going to hate this movie for one of two reasons. The first reason is that they'll think it is a movie that is pandering to Hollywood, because it is a movie about movies in some ways. Number 2, some people will see it as Steven Spielberg just simply giving himself a pat on the back because this is a movie about him. But I don't think that those are valid arguments, in my opinion. For one, I don't think this is a movie about movies, as much as some people do think that. There is, of course, a love of movies in it, and I think that's what this movie is about. This movie is about the love of making movies, not about the love of Hollywood or of the idea of Hollywood awards or anything like that. It's about the passion that people have for making movies, which I think is a very important distinction to make. And I do think this is a movie about Spielberg, but it's not just about him. It's also sort of a love letter to his family and how much they helped him along in his filmmaking journey. I think where this movie does work best is when it is exploring Spielberg's own love of making movies. You can just tell with the way he's filming things that he cares so much about the craft of filmmaking, and he is one of a kind in that regard. This movie feels so special in that way, and it feels like the movie that Spielberg needed to make in some ways. There's also a lot of clever shots in here, which is to be expected from Spielberg, but it's sort of cool to see him sort of evolving his shots as his character in the story is becoming a more advanced filmmaker. The movie starts out with some more slightly amateurish shot work, which I think is purposeful because that's where the kid is starting. But as the movie goes on, you can see the shots becoming better and better and more beautiful. And that especially is true with the ending shot, which is so cleverly done and reflects something that is so interesting in the movie. All the performances in here are great in my opinion. I wholeheartedly disagree with the idea that Michelle Williams is playing her character over the top. I think her character as it is played makes a whole lot of sense in this movie. Overall, I think this is another great film from Spielberg, and if this is his film to go out on, what a film to go out on in my opinion. I think it's a fitting swan song, and it's sort of a movie that he needed to make, as he said before, and I think that there is so much here that shows that he did need to make this movie, and good for him for doing it. Now, on to our top 5, and wow, all of these movies are so good, and they were so close with one another, it's not even funny. But let's go ahead and get started with number 5, which is Tar. And what is so fascinating to me about this movie is the fact that Lydia Tar, the titular character, isn't even a real person, which is just so mind-blowing to me because she feels so utterly realistic. The movie plays you with this too, I feel like. It feels like you're watching an actual autobiography happening in real time, looking at the life of a person, looking at an actual biopic in real time. But I think that's part of the movie's purpose. It's trying to make everything feel as real as possible so that you're convinced that this character is a real person and so that you can feel a little more connected to them. And they do feel utterly human. I mean, the beginning interview in this feels like an interview that could have happened in real life with how the characters are talking and communicating with one another, and we get an impression for who Lydia Tarr is right out of the gate with that interview. And man, oh man, the performances. Cate Blanchett as Lydia Tarr, I mean, she was born for this role, and it makes sense why the director didn't want to have anyone else play this role, because it doesn't feel like anyone else could play this role. Cate Blanchett embodies Lydia Tarr with such an intense gravitas and such a unique subtlety in scenes that it's something where you're not even really sure how you're supposed to feel about this character, which I think is interesting, because the movie just presents the character as she is. Cate Blanchett is, of course, going to get all the credit for this movie, and deservedly so. She is a big part of it. But I don't think other performances should go unnoticed here either. Nina Hoss as her girlfriend Sharon is really interesting and provides a cool counterpart to Lydia, and she's sort of the one who shows how manipulative that Lydia can be. The fact that she treats her one way in one scene, but in front of other people she'll treat her in another way. It's interesting to see. And Julian Glover as Andres Davis, who was sort of a mentor to Lydia. It's very interesting how he treats her too. Shows how Lydia has different personas based on who she's interacting with. And that's part of the intrigue of Lydia Tarr as well, is the fact that she is not someone who we can ever really figure out, because it doesn't seem like she has one real personality. She'll act one way to one person, but then she'll act another way with her daughter, with her mentor, with the people she works with. And because of that, we never get to truly know who she is, even in her moments alone. This movie is super layered, and I just loved all that it had to offer, including the excellent music. At number 4 is the most insane horror movie of the year, without a doubt, and that is Barbarian. And I say insane as a complete compliment, because this movie came utterly out of nowhere, but worked so well in what it did. This is a case of a movie where I would say the deceptive trailers were actually a good thing. Without the deceptive trailer, we would have been let in on so many cool secrets that this movie had. And because of that, I actually don't want to talk about many of the secrets that this movie holds, because it would be spoiling the experience for you if you haven't seen it. It is an utterly wild ride with so many turns that you don't see coming, and all along it is high octane and just pure unfettered horror. This is probably the scariest movie I saw this year. In fact, I'd say it definitely is. This movie also has a feel of sort of a classic horror movie in many ways. The villain in here sort of feels like a classic horror villain, but it also updates for the modern times, so it feels like a good combination of modern and classic horror, and I think it works for that reason. I think this movie is so unique and deserves so much more love than it got. I think it got a lot of backlash, unfortunately, but for the people that loved it, I am so happy that they did, because this movie deserves all the love it has. At number 3 is a movie that, of course, has gotten called overrated now, but it is Everything Everywhere All at Once. And no, this movie is not underrated. It deserves all the love it's gotten, and to anyone who is calling it their favorite movie of the year, I totally understand why, and I do not disagree with you by any means. Just for me, there were 2 movies that I liked a little better. But Everything Everywhere All at Once was at number 1 for quite some time this year, and deservedly so. This movie is so unique, and it feels like what cinema is meant for. At its core is a story of a Chinese immigrant family, including a woman who just is struggling with finishing her taxes and understanding her relationship with her daughter. But the story becomes much more as she discovers the idea that there is a multiverse out there, and that there are many different possibilities of the lives that she has, and that her daughter is sort of a villain in this world, and she sort of has to stop her from creating a sort of horrible timeline where everything sort of coalesces all together. And it is such a cool plot line and so much fun and brings to light so many possibilities. But at the heart of it all is it's just that, a heart. This movie has so much love to give and so many powerful messages that it has to say, and I think that's why so many people connected with it. But let's go ahead and talk about those other aspects, because those other aspects are great too. I love that they actually take advantage of the multiverse and do some super creative things with it. The fact that they have a world with hot dog fingers is so utterly ridiculous, but it works so completely well. And the fact that they actually use all sorts of different types of visual effects to represent these worlds is awesome. I love the fact that there's a world with just straight up rocks with googly eyes on them, and it is such a fun thing that they explore with. And I didn't think rocks with googly eyes could make me laugh so much, but they did. And I didn't think that there could be a way that someone like Ke Huy Quan could nail a character so well as Waymond Wang. I didn't expect I'd ever see him on screen again, but he's here, and he delivers such a bravura performance. And Michelle Yeoh is great here too. I love that she's getting so much love, and her performance is by far one of my favorites for the year. And Stephanie Hsu shouldn't go without notice either. She's great in this film too. And Jamie Lee Curtis is a lot of fun here for as wild as her performance is. There's so much to love about this movie, so much creativity, so much beautiful messaging in this movie, and I can understand why so many people loved it, and it deserves it. Everything Everywhere All at Once is a special cinematic experience. Well, with how much I praise Everything Everywhere, that should tell you how much I absolutely adore my top two movies. And yeah, I'd give both of these top two a perfect 5 out of 5. If Everything Everywhere All at Once was a movie that was doing a whole bunch of stuff and doing a crazy amount, then Aftersun is sort of the stark opposite in many ways. This movie is super stripped back and deceptively simplistic, and as it's just focusing on a story between a father and a daughter on a vacation, and how the daughter is discovering that her father may not be exactly who he's presented himself to be. But it's in its simplicity that is what makes me adore this movie so much. It is such a heartfelt story, and I don't think a movie hit me emotionally quite as hard as this one did. It just shows the story of a parent and a child in a way that feels so raw and real, and there's so many reasons for that. One of the reasons is because of how it's filmed. I love that it's filmed like watching a home video in many ways. It feels very rough and fractured, sort of like a child's memory would be. Or like a child's memory would be of watching a home video. They only see some of the stuff that they remember, and then upon watching the home video, some other memories will be triggered in their mind. And that's how the movie plays out. It has adult Sophie watching home videos of her and her father. I like that it frames it that way. And it creates for a story where you do have to fit some of the pieces together yourself. And it's interesting because you're having to sort of see this movie in a child's eyes. You're almost having to go back to this childlike perspective. And it creates a very haunting, otherworldly feeling, in my opinion, because it makes you think about how you viewed your parents as a child. It makes you realize that sometimes as a child, the way your parents might have acted in certain situations that you may not have understood then, you're seeing differently now as an adult. And I like that the director, Charlotte Wells, just nails that uncanny valley feeling that you can have as a child. And the performances nail that vibe too. Frankie Corio as Sophie is by far the best child performance of this year. Her performance, she just knocks it out of the park. She is great in this film, and I just loved how she nailed the complexities of this 11-year-old child. I like that they let this child have some very real moments, and that they don't treat her as just a child, but they treat her as a human being who has some real complex things going through her mind. And Paul Mescal as Callum, oh my goodness, probably my favorite performance of the year, I would have to say. He is excellent in this role, and it's so heartbreaking to watch because you know that he is struggling with something, but we never actually figure out what the struggle is, as he is struggling with the fact that he having to be a single father to Sophie as he's struggling with depression, with suicidal thoughts. That seems to be a possibility in many parts of this movie, but there could be other things going on too, and we never figure it out. And I like that we never figure it out, because we are watching this from the child's perspective. But that makes it all the more tragic, because we don't know, and we feel like we can't really reach out to him, much like Sophie feels like she can't really do anything about it. And like I said about the cinematography, I love that this movie is filmed like a home video feel, but there's also these very creative nightclub scenes that are filmed. And at first you're like, what are these nightclub scenes doing in here where we can barely see anything besides a strobe light and Paul Mescal's character in little shots and little pieces? But the nightclub scene starts having more purpose as the movie goes on, and when you realize it, you are filled with cold chills. And the way the movie ends, oh my goodness, one of the most memorable ending shots I've seen in recent memory. And I don't want to spoil it because it works so utterly well, but it made me tear up immediately because of how well it worked. And it just leaves you with a haunting feeling and an impact that just can't be denied. Check this movie out if you haven't. It deserves your attention. And before I go into my number one, I just wanted to list off some honorable mentions. Now, I'm not going to be talking about these movies in any detail, but here are 10 honorable mentions. Yes, 10 because this was a great year for movies, but here they are. What is my number one movie? Well, this is not a movie I expected to be my number one when I went into it, but I did go into this movie with an open mind. But nevertheless, whenever I think cinema, this is the movie I think about this year. Yes, the Tollywood movie RRR is my movie of the year, and it deserves it. This is cinema at its purest and most unadulterated form, in my opinion. When I think of what I want to see when I go into a movie, this is a movie that would immediately come to mind because it has everything in it. And I'm not joking. This movie has so much in its 3-hour runtime, and somehow it makes it all work. This is a buddy comedy movie. This is a musical. This is a drama. This is a love story. This is a story about British imperialism. It is a story about revolution. It is a story about finding love for those who you may not have expected to find love for. It is so many things, but it works so well. This movie is mainly about the story of Bhim and Raju, who are two real-life Indian revolutionaries. Now, of course, for this story and the way it's presented, there are places where you will realize that this story is clearly exaggerated and clearly over the top, but I think it works for the movie. I think it really does. And making these revolutionaries larger than life is what I imagine is something that is very inspirational for Indians who have been inspired by these revolutionaries in the past. And for that reason, I do think it works. And I do still think the characters are presented as real and human too. There are many moments when they are presented in very down-to-earth ways, especially in their respective missions. Bhim has a mission of saving his daughter, whereas Raju's mission is more large-scale in context of the movie once you figure out what it is. But I like that the movie presents both of their missions as equally important. I love the friendship that Raju and Bhim develop. It is built originally on them not understanding who each other is and what their respective missions are, which leads to a very tragic falling out in part of the movie, but once that understanding happens, it creates an epic feeling of victory that is so great and so wonderful that I just couldn't help but have the widest grin across my face when that happened. These characters are so endlessly likable in this movie, and it's hard to not root for their friendship, in my opinion. And the music in this movie is so good. This movie somehow manages to be a musical as well, and it just works. I don't know how to explain it. You just need to see it. It works. I could go on and on about this movie, like talking about how the visuals are striking and are better than any Marvel movie this year, or the fact that the action is so propulsive and fun, or the fact that this movie just keeps on escalating and keeps on going up in tension consistently over its 3-hour runtime. But all I can say is just watch this movie. It is such a delight and deserves so much love. RRR is cinema in its purest expression that I can think of, and it may well end up being one of my favorite movies of all time. It is that good. So yeah, those were my top 15 movies of 2022. What were your favorite movies of 2022? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies on this channel, along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave a like on this video and subscribe to see more content from me. And now, on to regular reviews, which I'm very excited to get started on. But until then, I will see you on the next video.